Well, welcome into Bayou Roar on this episode. We are going to be talking about Blake Baker deciding to return to LSU, as well as a recap of National Signing Day for the Tigers. But of course, we have to start with the biggest news that came out of this past week, honestly, after Kiffin being hired, of course, which is that Blake Baker has decided to stay. Now, this did not look very good as of just a couple of days ago, as Tulane was making a very, very big push to get Blake Baker to become their new head coach. And look, that would have made a lot of sense. Blake Baker played at Tulane, has a lot of connections there. Would have been easy to see him go there. And honestly, there was a lot of, gratitude from LSU fans, especially saying, "Hey, you know what? If he ends up going there, I mean, we can't blame him. I mean, he knows that school really well, and only makes sense." But Baker decided to turn them down. He also applied for the Memphis head coaching job, and apparently Memphis, started to make a later push and offered him a little bit more of an NIL incentive, in terms of how much he would be able to spend there and all that stuff. And it kind of looked like maybe Memphis was going to be a player in it. And then, like late into the week, like maybe Thursday night, there was pretty much all signs pointing to, all right, Baker to Tulane is a done deal, off the table, all these things. And then Friday, as the day goes on, there's still no announcement. I'm still refreshing my feed for all of the recruiting stuff. And then it was like kind of as the evening started to set in, like 5, 6 o'clock, there was rumblings like, hey, I don't think this is happening anymore. Hey, I think Tulane is now being informed that Baker's not going to become their new head coach and all these things. And he's also not going to go to Memphis. He's going to stay at LSU. And then, like late last night, LSU finally tweets out a picture of Blake Baker hitting the wind bar in the tunnel going out to Tiger Stadium. And it was like, that's when I finally knew, okay, he's not leaving. He is absolutely staying. And that is obviously huge for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost, it really helped you with your recruiting base. Honestly, I think a lot of these guys really respect Blake Baker and what he's been able to do in just a few seasons in Baton Rouge, kind of restoring a lot of the defensive, just glory, I guess you can say, at LSU that's been missing for such a long time. Blake Baker obviously connects really well, I think, with this era of football players. I think he just brings a lot of energy, a lot of hype, and he's a guy that obviously, players want to play for. And so, yes, you wouldn't have been shocked if he took a head coaching job. I mean, it wasn't like he was leaving to be a defensive coordinator somewhere else. I mean, he's one of the top paid, and he's going to still be one of the top paid defensive assistants in all of college football. I mean, I think they raised up his salary to 3 million is what I've seen so far out of the news. So obviously Baker, you know, is getting paid really well to be a defensive coordinator. He's not just going to leave for another job like that. But I mean, a head coaching job would have been a real possibility. And yet he decides to stay. He decides to stay put in Baton Rouge. And I think a lot of the things that were starting to give me some hope that that could happen was actually with the recruiting class because, it was looking like maybe Baker was going to leave. And then you land Lamar Brown, you land Richard Anderson, you land Deuce Geralds. And those were three guys that I think were really torn on their decision because they weren't sure if Baker was going to be back, who their position coach was going to be, all this kind of stuff. And then as those commitments started to file in, it was like, well, is Baker coming back? So obviously very good just from that aspect, but also now you've got just this really balanced coaching staff. You've got the offensive prowess of Lane Kiffin, and then you've got the defensive prowess of Blake Baker. And I'm not saying that it's going to just be, this thing where they come out of the tunnel next year and they just dominate the entire schedule from start to finish. As we're going to talk about, there's still a lot of work that has to be done on this LSU roster, but it already gives you a leg up having continuity on the defensive staff and really only bringing in, newer members on the offensive side of the ball, but it's led by obviously the greatest mind in college football when it comes to offense. So Blake Baker returning is obviously huge. I mean, you cannot, state that enough. But then also, as of just like 10 minutes ago, when I saw this news, and I'm going to share it on here. So this has basically happened on Saturday morning following signing day. That pretty much LSU is set to hire Elijah Robinson as its new defensive line coach. Robinson was at Texas A&M from 2018 to 2023, and most recently he had been the Syracuse defensive coordinator. However, Syracuse I think was demoting him to like co-DC or like something like that, and I guess he didn't like that, so he was willing to take calls from other places. And so now Blake Baker also lands a very, very high level defensive line coach. Now, this obviously means that Kyle Williams is more than likely done and he is heading out the door. Kyle Williams to me was always kind of a strange hire. I felt like while he had obviously the NFL experience, while obviously he had a lot of connections and ties to the LSU program, it felt like a strange fit, honestly, because he hadn't really coached outside of high school. And while, yes, obviously, it wasn't like he was just taking over the whole defensive line. His main focus was defensive tackle, the position that he played, the position that he knows the best. It just felt weird because this is a guy that's never had to come in and recruit before. This is a guy who's never had to really come in and, you know, teach college kids before. And so it felt like a weird move, but a move obviously they had to make kind of later in the process because Bo Davis left, very, very late to go to the Saints. Like Bo Davis leaving kind of left them high and dry with really not a whole lot of options available. And so the fact that, you were able to, I don't want to say get by, I don't want to make it seem like Kyle Williams was just like a 1 year rental that you were willing to use to get to the next year where you could hire somebody else. But that is starting to feel like what it was, that Kyle Williams was kind of just a rental. And you said, okay, if it works out great, it works out great. And we'll keep him. And, great to have a former Tiger on staff, all those good things. But if he doesn't work out, well, then by the time the next, hiring cycle comes, we can go out and actually find a really, really good defensive line coach. And that's pretty much what they did. They got by through this season with Kyle Williams, and now they were able to go land a really, really great defensive line coach in Elijah Robinson, who's developed a lot of really great players over his time as a coach. So I love that hire. That's really going to kind of bring this whole defensive staff together because obviously with Baker staying, Corey Raymond's going to stay. Kevin Peoples is going to stay. Shoot, Jake Olson, the safeties coach, he's going to stay. I was trying to remember his name. I wanted to say Flint for some reason, but that's not it. Jake Olson's going to stay as your safeties coach. Like, you're going to have that continuity now on your defensive staff, which is obviously huge. And then you're upgrading your defensive line coach, honestly. And look, I'll say this about Kyle Williams, and we'll just kind of let him be. Obviously, Kyle Williams, that was awesome of him to come back, help his alma mater out, even though, yes, maybe it wasn't the best fit. And from some things that I had read and seen and listened to from other people, it felt like Kyle Williams didn't really necessarily love coaching at the college level. It felt like it was something that like he kind of did more so out of a service for LSU rather than like he just desperately wanted to be a college coach. So I think at the end of the day, this is just going to be best for all parties involved because I think if Kyle Williams just doesn't really want to coach at the college level, then just let him go. Just let him walk out the door and find somebody else that does want to do that and will be really good at it. And that's what you're getting with Elijah Robinson. But coaching staff wise, it seems like the staff is really starting to come together. I think really the only piece that's kind of left now, I think a lot of attention was obviously put on keeping Baker. I think Kiffin understood the assignment that, like, hey, I've got to keep this guy here at all costs. And with the big pushes from Tulane and Memphis and all that stuff, like, that was obviously priority number one. But now I think your next priority, as you continue to kind of finalize your offensive staff a little bit, because I don't think all of those positions are necessarily finalized per se. We got a good idea of who's on the staff, but it's about, kind of making sure all of the ducks are in a row. I think Frank Wilson is your next priority. And look, there's been a lot of mixed reports and rumors about how the building has been since Kiffin arrived and Frank Wilson, maybe being mad or something like that, that he didn't really get a shot to be the head coach. I don't know. Those are all rumors. Those are all hearsay. All I know is this: Frank Wilson, out of his mouth a couple weeks ago, and unless something dramatic changed, I mean, this is what he said. He said, I love LSU. I'd be willing to do whatever it takes to, to help LSU out. Maybe he didn't really mean that in the moment. Maybe he was just saying that because it was the right thing to say. But I really do believe that Frank Wilson loves LSU and he loves being here. And I think if you're Kiffin, you've got to find a role for Frank Wilson on this staff. If nothing else, but because of his recruiting prowess. He is such a good recruiter, especially for the state of Louisiana. I think Frank Wilson has to have a role on this staff moving forward. So now that you've got Blake Baker lined up, I think you need to now secure Frank Wilson on the staff moving forward. And of course, they're busy figuring everything out for the bowl game, coming up whenever that's going to be, whenever they finally announce what bowl game LSU is going to. But once that is kind of done and they start to game plan for that, you need to find a way to keep Frank Wilson on this staff. I think that's going to be the next big domino that you need to fall into place. But that is, obviously all of the big stuff when it comes to coaching this week. And obviously Blake Baker was huge news, but LSU had a big day recruiting, and we need to talk about what National Signing Day looked like for LSU and for what this is going to mean for Kiffin's first year in Baton Rouge. Well, it was definitely a happy National Signing Day, or early signing day, I guess, for LSU, as obviously it maintains most of the class that it had put together, including obviously the big three, as we're probably going to end up calling them for this class, which was Lamar Brown, Richard Anderson, and Deuce Gerald. You could probably throw Trenton Henderson in there as well as another guy that they were just really keen on keeping in this class. But really, those three were the biggest three that, LSU fans especially wanted to make sure were kept as a part of this recruiting class. You were able to hold on to them. You were able to kind of keep most of this class together, only having, I think, two flips. You had a safety that ended up flipping to Florida at the end of the process, and then you had an offensive lineman in Bryson Cooley that ended up flipping to Alabama towards the end of the process. And look, those things are going to happen. But honestly, this, signing day for LSU could not have gone any better, because this is one of those things, when it comes to the coaching change, that is always the most difficult thing to predict. And that's why this is like really one of the first things that I wanted to talk about why this is so big for Lane Kiffin, this signing day period, because what's the one of the biggest questions that gets brought up when a coaching change occurs? Yeah, people ask about the staff, people ask about this, that, and the other. But one of the biggest questions that always comes up is what's going to happen to the recruiting class? What's going to happen to a recruiting class built off of the previous staff? How are they going to be able to maintain the top players from that recruiting class? And are they going to be able to hold on to them? Are they going to be able to keep everything together? And Kiffin was able to do that. Kiffin was able to hold on to all of the big time players in this class. And honestly, I think only having two flips and only a handful of decommitments as well honestly just shows how excited the recruits are for the coaching change and just how much work the staff put into making sure that this class stayed together. And of course, it also, I mean, you got to give Kiffin some credit as well. He worked like a dog to make sure that they kept Blake Baker so that these defensive guys wouldn't go somewhere else. He made sure that this class had the best chance possible of staying together by doing the, off the field, I guess, work by trying to get things lined up, a new defensive line coach. I mean, it was probably about Wednesday, Thursday, the rumors started to kind of rumble around about Elijah Robinson potentially being, you know, the new LSU defensive line coach if Kiffin was able to kind of pull the trigger and bring him in. And so obviously, like Kiffin understood how important it was to make sure that this class stayed together, and for good reason. Because like those three that I listed off the top, Gerald, Brown, Anderson, that's a lot of talent that you couldn't just let slip through the door. So obviously, really great that Kiffin was able to basically put to rest one of the biggest questions that happens in a coaching change: what's going to happen to the recruiting class? But another reason why this is really huge for Lane Kiffin is that high school talent has not always necessarily been a huge factor into his previous teams. We've talked about this a little bit, I think, on our last episode and talking about Kiffin being hired. A reason why you choose to come to LSU over Ole Miss is because of the things you're able to do in high school recruiting. You are able to land much better high school recruits at LSU than you are Ole Miss. And that's something that's very hard, I think, for Ole Miss fans to recognize. But I mean, Ole Miss right now, according to On3, I think is what, 24th or 25th in the country recruiting wise out of high school purely, which is fine, except when you think about the fact that they flipped at the last second Jace Matthews, who's a 4 or 5 star receiver, depending on which service you use. But according to Rivals and On3, he's a 5 star receiver. You got him to flip late. That definitely bumped you up a couple of spots. But really, other than that, it's mostly 3 stars, like 2 4 star guys. Like the recruiting base at Ole Miss is not the same as it is at LSU when you're signing Lamar Brown, who's not just a 5 star player, not just the number one player in his position, but he is the number one player in the country for this year's recruiting class. You also have Richard Anderson, who is the number one player in his position nationally. You have Deuce Gerald, who is a top 5 prospect in his position. Like the guys you're able to land at LSU are just much different than the guys you're able to land at Ole Miss coming out of high school. And again, the crash out from Ole Miss fans continues to be hilarious because they keep making jokes like when LSU has a guy flip somewhere else or when LSU, had somebody sign, elsewhere or whatever. Ole Miss fans were quick to be like, ha ha ha, what's going on in Baton Rouge now, huh? LOL. And it's like, now, LSU fans are responding by posting the recruiting rankings, and well, Ole Miss is quick to respond with, well, Ole Miss builds mostly out of the portal anyways, so we can't really, they don't have the same resources for high school recruiting, so we're dependent on the portal, so don't just use that, like could y'all be crashing out and coping any harder than you are right now? Like just face the facts that your school does not have nearly the same recruiting net as LSU. It never has, and it never will be. Now, it is true. Yes, Kiffin has utilized the portal very well to give y'all competitive teams, but that's because he's had to do that. And that is a fact that you stated, yes, but you are coping for the fact that honestly, you're probably not going to have that same success in the portal come this time around because well, there's going to be a lot of questions about Pete Golding, the offensive staff, all that kind of stuff. There just is. I'm sorry. And you really think a lot of top, notch offensive transfer portal guys are going to be like going to Ole Miss? They don't have an OC, they don't have an offensive staff put together. I'm going to go there. I mean, come on, y'all. Like, what are we doing? What are we talking about here? But again, this is why Kiffin chose to come to LSU. Just based off of this high school recruiting base alone, you're already taking a major step in the right direction. And so, I mean, if you can retain, your current class or sorry, your current roster on top of this class, I mean, that's obviously a huge step in the right direction for you being competitive, and competing for the college football playoff and potentially a national championship, even, early on in Lane Kiffin's tenure here at LSU. Because again, I'm not trying to say that they're going to go out and win a national championship, but I mean, just from the top end of this class alone, you've got some really key pieces that are going to help you moving forward. So, all that being said, this is another reason why it's great for Kiffin is because he's never really had the high school support in recruiting. It's always mostly just been anchored by transfer portal guys. And so now you can add high school talent onto that as well and could really balance out your team to being awesome. Now, another reason why this is huge for Kiffin, and not that Kiffin needed this to be proven to him, but this more so cements the fact that like he was right in estimating that the LSU brand is just so much bigger than most brands in college football. There are very few brands that exceed LSU in college football. And this class is kind of a big reason that proves as to why that is. Because in the middle of all of the chaos of switching coaches, of having an interim, the chaos that came with the coaching search and trying to get Kiffin from Ole Miss and all that stuff, LSU lost very, very little in this class. That normally does not happen. Normally, a recruiting class kind of falls apart a little bit. You maybe keep a couple of the top end guys because you're begging and pleading, like, hey, please stay, please stay, please stay. But you lose a lot of the kind of the middle of the pack guys in a recruiting class. And you didn't really have that happen. You really didn't have that happen in this class. Yes, you had a couple guys flip because, with a new staff, they probably said, okay, he's probably going to try to go recruit a guy like offensive lineman, for instance. Basically, LSU had a trade, I guess, with Ole Miss in terms of you know an LSU 3-star offensive lineman flipped to Ole Miss. Ole Miss 3-star defense or offensive lineman, sorry, flipped to LSU. Basically, you had a trade off because let's just be completely honest. Lane Kiffin knows specifically what he's looking for in an offensive lineman for his system. And, that's what he wanted. He wanted, to have a guy that he knew would be able to come in and run his system, even as a 3-star guy, or could at least enter the fold as a backup. That 3-star that flipped to Ole Miss probably flipped to Ole Miss more so out of spite than anything else, because I mean the first thing he said when he flipped was spot the ball. So, anyways, that's kind of why that happened. But all that being said, the LSU brand, man, and maybe you can give credit to obviously the staff, Frank Wilson, Blake Baker, all those guys for holding on to them, and that is a big part too. But a lot of these guys, they want to line up and play for LSU. Like, yeah, coaching matters and getting the right coach matters. But there is still a thing where these guys want to play for LSU. And they're going to give LSU the benefit of the doubt more likely than not. And pretty much, I think it was pretty, I'm trying to find the right words here. I don't know if I'll be able to find it, but there was never really a lot of wavering amongst the LSU beat writers and amongst the LSU, like, quote unquote, recruiting insiders that Lamar Brown and Richard Anderson would ever flip. Deuce Gerald's maybe got a little bit, into some hotter water for sure. But Brown and Anderson, really, there was nothing that ever indicated that, hey, they're going to flip. They kind of just want to take their time to make sure the staff is actually coming together in the right way. But they were pretty much firm on their LSU commitments because they're Louisiana kids that want to play for LSU. And again, that's why you come to LSU. That's why you choose a school like this, because the brand is just so much bigger and holds on to so many more kids than Ole Miss or whoever else is out there in the world. So, all that being said, obviously very happy that for Kiffin, that kind of cements again one of the things that you said at your press conference was the branding, man. I mean, this LSU brand, you put that together with what we've been able to do in the portal before. Holy smokes. And again, this is just high school recruiting right now, but the LSU branding is just so much bigger and better than the majority of college football. And it kind of got cemented in this class as to why that's the case. Now, there are some things that I think you love about this recruiting class, and there's other things that you look at and you say, okay, there's going to be some needs that are going to have to be addressed in the transfer portal point blank period because holy smokes, you're going to be in a world of hurt. But here's what I love about this recruiting class. It goes without saying. The defensive line talent on this class is off the charts. We've talked about them a lot, but the first four players on the list for LSU on three and rivals is Lamar Brown, Richard Anderson, and Deuce Gerald. And then at the fourth spot is Trenton Henderson, a defensive edge. Those are the first four guys you see when you pull up the recruiting class on three. And that's for good reason because those are the best players that you've gotten in this class. When it comes to defensive line, you are stacked there now. You add them on top of Gabe Relaford, on top of hopefully Don McKinley decides to stay, Dominic McKinley, Ahmad Bro. You add those guys into a room that's already pretty loaded down with guys. Oh man, that is a pretty scary thing that you are adding into the fold is these guys right here. Again, it's hard to kind of gauge how good true freshmen are going to be, but just based off the potential alone, you get really, really excited about having three guys like that and a fourth and Trenton Henderson to add into the fold because you can see the potential that they all have. So obviously that's very, very exciting for LSU here, the defensive line talent that you've gotten. But also the defense overall also ended up landing some really, really great players in this class. Havon Finney, who is a cornerback in this class, he is 6'2", 170, coming out of California. He is the 14th best corner in the class, according to On Three. And look, this was a guy that Corey Raymond absolutely loved. Corey Raymond was absolutely ecstatic about getting this guy. This was a guy that he wanted. Havon Finney even said he was not going to sign with LSU unless he kind of knew for sure that Corey Raymond was coming back. And so that was kind of a good sign when he signed on, I think it was Wednesday, like late Wednesday night when he signed. That was obviously a really good sign that, hey, Raymond's probably locked in and secured moving forward. But listen, I mean, at this point, you don't really question Corey Raymond when it comes to the guys that he's looking for. DJ Pickett should be a huge example of that. I mean, I'm not sure how much he played into the Mansour Delane recruitment, but Mansour Delane is obviously a huge example as to why you bring a guy in like Corey Raymond because he can see the talent and he can develop the talent very, very well. So Havon Finney joining the fold, and now you have a 6'2" and a 6'5" corner on the roster. That's really big time for LSU. So having Havon Finney is awesome. You also got Aiden Hall, a safety out of Edna Carr, teammates with Richard Anderson. He's a guy that a lot of people are really, really high on. And then you also added a guy named Des Ellis, who's kind of like an athlete, I guess is how you would probably, you know, classify him as if you were, because he's played on both sides of the ball in high school. But he's a guy that's probably going to end up being a corner at LSU. He's a 3-star prospect, so it's not like, you're expecting him to go out there and maybe start day one. But he's another guy that is 6'2", 185 from Louisiana. And again, this is just a guy that you say, okay, you're telling me Raymond really wanted this guy? Okay, I'm all board for it. If Des Ellis comes in and he can just even be a rotational piece for you, that's a huge win. So defensively, not just on the defensive line, but overall, you added some really good guys into the fold that you needed to add to this roster. Because again, you're going to lose Mansour Delane. There's no telling what the defensive depth is going to look like once the transfer portal happens in January. You are probably going to throw all the money in the world in making sure DJ Pickett stays on the roster. And I would feel pretty good that he would, considering he's played a lot this year. Corey Raymond's his guy. Like, I would feel pretty secure that, Pickett is going to stay, but you just never know in this era. But you think about some of the guys like PJ Woodland, like, is he going to stay? I hope he does. PJ Woodland's really improved a lot this year, but it seems like they've played a lot more Pickett Delane as the season has gone on, and PJ Woodland's kind of been more of a rotational piece. Does he want to go somewhere else where maybe he can start on the outside every single game? I don't know. Or does he come back thinking I can compete for a outside spot, and next year it's a Woodland Pickett, opposite ends room? I don't know. I just don't. You also don't know what Tamarcus Cooley's going to do. Is he going to leave and go to the NFL early as a redshirt sophomore? Is he going to enter the transfer portal and go somewhere else? I don't know. But what I do know is that in this era, you have to try to grab as many guys as you can to replace whatever you're losing. And Havon Finney and Dez Ellis are two guys that are definitely big time gets for you, entering this next season, because no matter what happens with Woodland or whoever, you feel good that you got those guys. And again, you got another guy at safety coming in Aiden Hall that is pretty highly touted. And if he wants to come in and add into the safety room as well, knowing you're probably going to lose a couple of your safeties as well, then so be it. I trust the staff when it comes to evaluating the players that they want for their scheme. So, with that being said, you added a lot of really great defensive weapons, and I think that is really nice. But the last thing that I really truly do love about this class is that you also added some offensive skill guys at receiver and tight end that I think are really good for you. You did add Jabari Mack, who's I think the top receiver in the state of Louisiana. This kid's 6 foot, 200 pounds. A lot of people really, really high on him, thinking that he's going to be a guy that can come in and play really, really well for LSU. And of course, it always helps when you get those Louisiana guys that understand, LSU, and they want to come in. And so a lot of people really high on Jabari Mack. Corey Barber, another guy that a lot of people are very, very high on. He is, these guys aren't huge, but 6 foot, 185. A lot of the staff was really high on Corey Barber coming in. He will be a big get. JC Anderson, a tight end that they got to flip from Ole Miss to LSU. He is from Illinois. He is, oh my gosh, 6'6", 230. So you talk about a guy he's at 230, maybe he has to put on a little bit more weight, but you're talking about having potentially Trey'Dez Green and this kid going out there, a 6'7", 6'6" combo at tight end. That's insane to think about. So JC Anderson is a guy that a lot of people are high on. Now, you do have a couple of, receivers that a lot of people are kind of mixed on. Isaiah Washington from Louisiana, as well as a guy that, you know, like Rivals has him as a 4-star. Other services have him at, 3 stars. But overall, this is a guy that, if they think he's a guy that can go out there and play really well. Oh, actually, he is a safety. I'm so sorry. Isaiah Washington is a safety. That is my bad. It's the next kid up on the list that is in that boat, which is Braden Allen. Braden Allen is a receiver, 6'1", 175. Again, kind of mixed results. 4-star on Rivals, 3 stars on other services. But Braden Allen was a guy that was committed to Oklahoma, and you were able to flip him pretty much almost immediately as Lane Kiffin was announced as the head coach, which means Braden Allen is not only a guy that Kiffin and this staff think could be very, very valuable to them, in terms of what he brings to the receiving room, at LSU, but Braden Allen is also pumped about what Lane Kiffin's offense could mean for him. So obviously, this is a guy that they were really excited about flipping from Oklahoma. And then, really, other than that, that's about it. This class is really only built off of, surprisingly enough, 14 commitments and 14 signees. Yes, you had a couple people flip, you had a couple people decommit, but it's just based off of 14 guys, which honestly should give you some encouragement. With 14 commits, you have the 11th ranked class in the country. So that's another thing I kind of love is like the sky's kind of the limit when the portal opens in January. I mean, you could add a whole bunch of guys to this class, and this could end up being a top 10 class when with the addition of the transfer portal guys on top of the recruiting you've already done at the high school level. So, with that being said, obviously, you know, there are some really great things to love about this recruiting class from just the high school end. But there's also some things that I think we do need to keep our eye on talking about the portal because there are some major red flags when it comes to this overall class. And so, really, what I've kind of categorized these things as are musts for the portal, which is going to open up in January, and some maybes for the portal. The musts are pretty point blank and 100% locks on what you're going to have to get. And the first one is quarterback. There is not a single quarterback commit in this high school class, not a single one. This was a position that was always going to have to be addressed in the portal, whether it was Lane Kiffin coming to coach, Kenny Dillingham, whoever. But quarterback is for sure one of the first positions you're going to have to address in the transfer portal. It looked like you were maybe going to be able to get Duckworth to flip from South Carolina to LSU, but that did not end up happening. And so now you're talking about a situation where you weren't able to flip a guy on signing day. You didn't get a guy in the recruiting class last year, other than Michael Van Buren out of the portal. You did not sign a high school quarterback last year. Colin Hurley, we don't know his situation. He's been like away from the team for like 2 months now or something like that. It's been crazy. But Colin Hurley has been missing in action. Garrett Nussmeier's gone. You don't know what Van Buren's going to do. Is he going to stay? Is he going to leave? Does he really fit Kiffin's system? I don't know. But here's the thing. No matter which way you slice it, no matter which way you look at it, quarterback is your biggest position of need going into the portal. Now, the good thing is there are going to be some names out there that I think could be really good. Sam Levitt from Arizona State is the first one that comes to mind. But there will always be some really good quarterbacks that enter the portal, even if they're just trying to see what their value is. And again, Van Buren was a guy like last year that, I don't know if really a whole lot of people expected him to leave, Starkville, but that was a guy that, yeah, maybe he didn't really pan out as well as you would have thought this year at LSU, but he was a guy that started a lot of SEC games the year before at Mississippi State, had some decent numbers, and you would have thought, oh, he's going to stay. And then he didn't. And, you just have surprises like that every single year. So, especially now that Kiffin is at LSU, and again, the LSU branding being so large, there's going to be a lot of quarterbacks that go, man, should I potentially throw my name out there just to see if Kiffin's interested in bringing me to Baton Rouge? Because that could be a dream scenario for me. So, with that being said, quarterback is obviously your biggest position in need because you might just be left with Michael Van Buren at the end of the year, and you don't even know if he's staying. So, you may be looking for 2, 3 quarterbacks in the portal to come to Baton Rouge. So, with that being said, that is your biggest must. But your other biggest must is offensive line. Offensive line is by far if quarterback is 1A, offensive line is 1B. Now, you did sign Bryson Martinez out of Gonzales, Louisiana, in this class. And look, by all means, this kid looks like a kid that's got all the potential in the world. 6'5", 290 pounds. Like, a lot of people are very, very high on Bryson Martinez. This was a guy that they really made sure they tried to keep in this class. But again, I mean, you look at the guys that they threw out there this past year. They had guys like Carius Kern who went out there, and Kern definitely played the best, of a lot of the younger guys that went out there. And left tackle was never really going to be, I think, his position full time at LSU. I think he's more of a guard. But I mean, even Kern struggled a little bit. Weston Davis was a guy that obviously a lot of people were very, very, big on because he's a big kid with a lot of potential. That didn't work out. And I don't know if it's necessarily offensive line coaching. I don't know if it's necessarily, you know, just they didn't, the offensive scheme was terrible. And so they were out of position or whatever. I don't know. But what I know is offensive line was terrible. Offensive line play was horrible. Even bringing in a veteran center like Braylon Moore, where you thought, okay, maybe that's going to help solve a lot of issues because at least you are more solidified at the center position than you were the year before. It's like maybe Braylon Moore came in a year too late because you put Braylon Moore on that offensive line with Will Campbell, with Emory Jones, Garrett Dellinger, Miles Frazier. Maybe LSU has a little bit more success on the offensive side of the ball with that group rather than having DJ Chester be the weakest link at the center position. I don't know. But what I do know is that if you're able to get Braylon Moore to come back, because I do think Braylon Moore is a really good center, it's just been overshadowed by the really poor play of the guys around him. I think that would be a big piece to come back. If you could get Kern to develop, play one of the guard spots, that would be huge. And then you kind of fill in the rest, with whoever you feel is worthy, then go for it. But offensive line has got to be the second biggest position you target. Now, the difficult thing is offensive line is usually one of the groups that has like the least amount of people enter the portal. So you are going to be in a bidding war with the top end guys, trying to get them to come to your school. You're going to be having to talk their ear off. But again, is this a situation where some of these offensive linemen come in and go, hey, LSU has now got Lane Kiffin, big time offensive guy. They've got plenty of positions open because I don't think anybody outside of Braylon Moore should be secured a spot on the offensive line moving forward. They've got positions available that I could potentially move into and be a starter at. Does that intrigue some guys to not only where they enter the portal, but LSU's kind of their top choice? So I don't know, but offensive line is a definite must as well because you can't just rely on A, the guys that you've had this past year outside of Braylon Moore, and B, you can't even trust in, like a kid like Bryson Martinez because you just don't know what you're going to get out of him. It's not that I'm saying he's a bad player or that he won't be good. I think Bryson Martinez could be very good potentially if he hits, but that's the thing. When you're talking about true freshmen, you're not always a guaranteed, superstar. They kind of lucked into Will Campbell being so good as his true freshman season and Emory Jones being really good as well. But that's the thing. That's a roll of the dice sometimes that doesn't always work out for you. But it did that one time. So, anyways, Bryson Martinez is definitely a big get, but you've got to address the offensive line in the portal because that is going to be a huge weak spot for you. Because really, outside of Martinez, I mean, did you even sign? You signed Ryan Murray from Miami, Florida. Now, this kid's 6'4", 300. Probably going to be an interior guy from the projections on three, but he's a three-star kid. You know, a kid that's probably going to be more so, like I said, a rotational piece than like a full-time starter. But again, who knows? Maybe he hits and maybe he does end up being a really, really good player. Who am I to say? It's just, again, this is a position that you didn't really recruit very well in this cycle. You didn't grab a lot of the top end guys. So you're going to have to address it in the portal. So, with that being said, those are the two musts that I think you have to address in the portal come January. But the other spots that are kind of a maybe for me, the first one is safety, only because you are for sure losing AJ Halsey. And AJ Halsey is an absolute dog. So, like, that's going to be a big time loss for you. And you don't really know what Tamarcus Cooley's going to do. He's a redshirt sophomore, so like he could go to the draft if he wanted to. I don't really know if he's got a very high NFL ceiling right now. I would think he would want to come back and play another year, but who knows? Maybe this was a one and done year for him. Maybe he wants to go somewhere else. I don't know. I mean, I feel like Tamarcus Cooley has been a really good player all year long. It feels like, I mean, he's been really solid. I don't know why, he would want to leave and go somewhere else, but again, the portal era is very, very weird, and guys just kind of leave for whatever reason they want. And Cooley is a guy that I would definitely hate to lose, but you don't know what he's going to do. So you don't even know if Cooley's coming back. Now you will have Deshaun Spears, and he is looked really good in the games he's played in this year. Obviously, he had a huge game against Florida. He had a really nice couple plays that I noticed in the Arkansas game. And he's been rotated in more than that. It's just those are kind of the games that stand out in my mind for Deshaun Spears. But I think Spears would have started this year if you hadn't brought in both Halsey and Cooley. I think if only one of those guys comes, then you put Deshaun Spears in one of those other starting spots. So you definitely have, I think, one safety lined up with Deshaun Spears. It's just, do you want to bring in another veteran guy, just to kind of help, a guy that could be really good back there, maybe not a Halsey or even a Cooley level guy, but just a nice piece to rotate in because you have recruited pretty well at the safety position over the last couple of recruiting cycles. So it's like you got guys you can throw out there, but do you want to go get another veteran guy? That's really the only thing why this is a maybe for me. I don't think this is a you have to go get that kind of a guy, but maybe is safety a guy that you want to go grab another veteran? Again, and the same with the cornerback room. Do you want to go grab another veteran corner if a really good veteran corner goes into the portal, a guy like a Mansour Delane? I think you can't afford to not, at least roll the dice on that. Again, I know you like the guys you brought in. You love DJ Pickett, you love PJ Woodland, all those guys. And Pickett's probably going to be a starter no matter what. Being a 6'5" corner is just ridiculous. But do you take a chance on grabbing, a kid that's got a lot of starting experience or a kid that, can go out there and play really well for you, every single week? I think you should, but I don't think it's a necessity. That's why it's a maybe for me. Safety and corner both. And then the last spot I've got is defensive end. You're losing Patrick Payton, you're losing Jack Pyburn, you're losing Jamari Butler. Those are your three guys that you knew were kind of going to be your 1 year rentals. But do you now take an opportunity and go out there and grab, if there's a very, very high end defensive end that enters the portal, do you go take it? I think you should, because even though you are getting Gabe Relaford back next year, you are bringing in Lamar Brown from the high school ranks. I think there's just something to be said that, like, LSU struggled this year to create pressure. They struggled to create pressure primarily with the defensive ends. And if Bernard Gooden was not on the defensive line, the whole defensive line as a whole, struggled to create pass rush. They just did. They were phenomenal run, defense. But they really struggled in pass rush. And I think if you're LSU and you go out and grab a really, really solid defensive end, a guy that can pretty much do it all, crash down, create pass rush, can be a really good run stuffer, I think you got to go out and get that guy. Because as good as Relaford could be, as good as Lamar Brown could be, you just don't really know who else beyond that. And I think going out there and getting somebody that's really, really good could be a big benefit to your defense. So again, is this a position that I think you have to go get? Not necessarily, but I think it would definitely help you moving forward because while you got Trenton Henderson, you got guys as well in the last couple of recruiting cycles that I think could be really good players if they stay, moving forward. I definitely think that's a position that you got to make sure you are very shored up in. Because I think that's the one area of this defense this year that's kind of been the weakest link. Is just the fact that you haven't always been able to create consistent pressure and always be consistent on every phase of the defensive line. So, but those are my biggest things I think you're still going to need to see from the portal this year. But overall, signing day is nonetheless very, very successful. This was the biggest success that you had recruiting, you know, this year. And I think overall as well, you should be very happy as Tiger fans of who you got. Now, there is still work to be done, but Blake Baker's back. The defensive staff is back. You upgrade your defensive line coach. I think you should feel really good as you're stacking up for the portal now in a couple months on where you stand. But that's all that we've got time for here today on Buy Your Roar. Thank you guys so much for following along. Hey, make sure to like, share, subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Hope you guys have a great weekend watching championship weekend of college football. And of course, let's go Tigers.